Good morning. Man, we got a little mini video for you guys today. It's good to see you guys. It's like usually I got time to take my mask off, find a microphone, but nope, not today. Happy New Year. It's nice and sunny, these brutal California winters. You guys, we had rain last week. I mean, so it's a struggle. I'm really impressed you guys made it out of the house today for this. So I think there's usually like a 4 or 5 day holding period when it rains. It's like, well, it rained last week, so let's stay inside. So no, it's so good to be. Thank you guys for joining us online. My name is Chris Kretzu. If you've not met, I'm the campus pastor here at South Hills. I'm excited to be here. Excited for a new year. I'm excited for everything that entails. And as we get started, for those of you guys that are here in person, you'll be able to see this. For those of you online, you won't. But I just want to thank and give a huge shout out to our senior pastors, Chris and Laura Songson, who are here hanging out with us today. I owe so much of who I am to who they are and the way that God used them in my life. And somehow gave them just extra doses of grace for me. At a young age, I interned at South Hills a long time ago, and I honestly can say I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the way that God used them in my life, not only just spiritually, but also as a pastor, as a husband, as a father, and so I'm super grateful. It's always great to have them here with us. Also, every year we do something at our campus called Read Every Day. Our goal is for our church to read the Bible every day. It's not necessarily to read through the entire Bible in a year. We kind of change it up every time, but the goal for us is to build and to cultivate this habit of spending time in God's Word, because it is the one thing that can keep us grounded through all of the chaos. That God's Word has stood for thousands of years, and God speaks to us. It is alive and moving and active, and it's useful for teaching and encouraging and training. And so every year we do this thing called Read Every Day. I sent out an email this week about that and some other information. If you guys would like to join us on that reading plan, we do it together as a community. It's all digital. You can do it on your phone. You can do it on your web browser, your iPad, whatever that looks like. I would love for you guys to join us. And so the best way right now, as I'm thinking about saying this, the best way to do that would probably be to text SH Connect to 94,000. If you do that, we will send you the information for it. You can also find the link on our social media profile if you'd like to do it that way. But we would love to have you join us in that. It's going to be a great year. I'm excited to do that together. You know, this last 12 months in 2020, there were a few words and phrases that we heard more than ever before. The phrase, maybe you guys are familiar with some of these phrases, unprecedented. You guys familiar with that word? The word uncertain, out of an abundance of caution. You guys can probably say all of these phrases with me, not even knowing what I'm going to say next. If you guys had to work remotely, you may have said or heard the phrase, "Can you unmute yourself?" If anybody had that experience? How are you holding up is our greatest go-to question. We are in uncharted waters, distance learning for the parents, trying times, essential. We are all in this together. We've heard a lot of these phrases over and over again over the last year. We've all said these probably at some point. I know I have. But there is one phrase that has really become essential during these uncertain and trying times. Since we're navigating these uncharted waters. So out of an abundance of caution during this unprecedented season of life, I think that it's important we talk about the new normal, because we are all in this together. You guys like that? I worded them all into one sentence. I thought that was really impressive. No, we're talking about this idea of new normal, and obviously we're spelling it a little bit different because there is a normal that we knew, and that normal doesn't quite exist anymore as much as we want it to, and we're going to talk about that a lot over these next few weeks, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. That's a neutral thing, and it is what we choose to make of it. And so we are living in a new reality, a new version of normal, a new year. And so the reality for us is that in light of the normal that we knew, a new one might not be that bad. In light of the normal that we had in January or February of last year, March, as we go on, April, May, these other times, in light of those normals, a new one might not be that bad. And some people have no real issue with the phrase. Is there, I hear myself talking back there. Does one of you guys, I think the live stream volume is on or something. It's going to throw me off. You guys ever watch a video of yourself and be like, that's what I sound like? Is that really what I sound like out there? So You know, some people, they don't really have an issue with the phrase new normal. And I've talked to other people who get really upset about it. They say, I don't want to have a new normal. I don't want to be forced into accepting these things as normal. And I get that. There's a sense of angst and frustration, resistance to accepting almost any part of 2020 as something that might continue as our regular everyday life. There's this tension around that. We can all agree that 2020 caused us to live and exist and function in ways that are not our preference. But if we are wise, we will ask ourselves the question, in light of what I have seen, in light of what I've experienced, in light of what I've learned, does it make sense for me to go back to normal? Does it make sense for me to go back to the way that things were? I get that there's some things we don't want to do anymore. I get that. But is the normal that we had, is the normal that we knew, is that really so good that we want to get back to that, or do we want to keep moving forward? There's some things I for sure don't want to go back to. Do you guys remember bowling? You would go put on somebody else's shoes and then stick your fingers in those 3 dark holes. And then you would cram your face with like hot wings and nachos. I mean, it was just like, yeah, that's weird. I don't see myself doing that anytime too soon. I went to a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old's birthday party over the holidays. And you guys remember blowing out candles on a cake? You guys ever seen a 5-year-old blow out candles on a cake? It's like a sprinkler system. I mean, it's just, there's certain things that it's like, okay, that's always going to be a different now. That's always going to be weird, a different reality for us. We don't always want to go back to normal. We owe it to ourselves, to our spouses, our friends, our families to ask the question, what was I doing before COVID that felt normal, but led to my undoing during COVID? What were the things that felt normal, that felt just like the routines, the ways I was living, the ways I was showing up in my relationships, the ways that I was engaging in my faith, the ways that I was handling my finances, planning for the future, all these types of things? What were those normal things that I was doing that when COVID hit, all of a sudden, like Kathy was talking about just a few minutes earlier, all of a sudden it started to feel like the walls were closing in. This was our normal routine, and it worked for a while, and then all of a sudden, as 2020 progressed, it led to an undoing for many of us, a challenge in our faith. Our relationships were strained. Our finances were oftentimes just kind of thrown out the window. Another way of asking this question is, what should I focus on now that I should have been focused on all along? What should I focus on now, starting off January 2021, that I should have really been focusing on the entire time? Do I want to go back to the way things were? Is that really who I want to be or how I want to live? Yes, I would like to be able to buy Clorox wipes in the store. That would be nice. But seeing the strain on the relationships or the challenges, the finances, the way our spiritual or emotional health was strained, is that something I want to go back to? Or can I be better or stronger because of what I've experienced? Is there a new normal, a new reality that we can get to? It would be tragic if in our quest for normalcy, we didn't learn any of the great lessons that God had for us last year. We want normalcy, but maybe we shouldn't be longing for the old normal. It's okay to embrace a new normal. New normal isn't bad when it's chosen, when it's lived out in courage, when it's lived out in faith, but the old normal can be bad when it's idealized or when it's idolized. In the book of Ecclesiastes, the wisdom book, the writer says this. He says, "Don't long for the good old days. This is not wise." Which is like automatically like, oh gosh, I really do long for the good old days. I really do miss the way that things used to be, the things that I used to be able to do. But he says, don't long for the good old days. This is not wise. He's ultimately trying to teach us that it's important to learn from the past and appreciate the past, but it's unhealthy to live in the past. We've got to be fully present. We've got to be invested and engaged in the reality that we are living in today. Researchers talk about something called rosy retrospection, this reality that we tend to minimize the negative moments of past experiences and accentuate the positive. Another way, 3 kind of illustrations of this is Disneyland, mobile church, and our first apartment. So I don't know if you guys are Disney fans. My family, we love going to Disneyland, and we would go oftentimes, but we live close enough so we would have a season pass. We would go for a couple hours, and then as soon as the kids started asking for us to buy them churros, we would leave. It was just kind of the way that it went. But every once in a while, we would go for a whole day, or we would see other families that were there for like a week for a full vacation. And I remember as a kid going to Disney World with my family, and oftentimes it's long lines and blisters on your feet and emptying the savings account and kids whining and melting down and all these types of things. But when you look back on it, you don't really remember that stuff as clearly. You remember the smiles and the fun, the adventure. Even for us, I remember even when we started out as a church, we were a mobile church. We met in a school here in Newport area and over at Ensign. And it was really hard. It was a lot of setup, a lot of tear down. There was no air conditioning. I don't know if anybody can remember what it was like in there. Some of you guys may remember that. But there's moments where it's like, do you guys remember the good old days? Like when it was so fun, right? It was like, no, it wasn't. It was so hard. It was fun also. But there's this reality that we tend to forget. And the last example, when my wife and I first got married, we lived in a 470 square foot closet, essentially. It was a tiny little place. And every once in a while, we're like, it was better then, right? It was like so fun and simple and everything was so small. And it was a nightmare then. Let me tell you, like we had no idea how to be married, how to live with each other. I mean, it was crazy. But this rosy retrospection, oftentimes what happens is that the tension of the present, the tension that we experience now, it causes us to romanticize the past. It causes us to think, man, wasn't it better then? Wasn't it better? But wouldn't it be better if we could just go back to the way that things were? It's so hard now. I wish that things were like they used to be. This isn't a new thing. This is something that we as humans have done for thousands of years. I want to look at a story today in the book of Exodus. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. We'll be there in just a minute, Exodus 16. But Israel, the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, they were in captivity. They were enslaved in Egypt for 430 years, Scripture tells us. They were in captivity. God heard their cries. They had been crying out this whole time for freedom, for God to save them, for God to lead them out of slavery. God hears their cries, and he sends a man named Moses to lead them out of captivity. Of course, Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt at the time, he did not make it easy, but through plagues, miracles, signs, wonders, God shows these incredible and tremendous displays of power and provision. One miracle after another, with the grand finale being the parting of the Red Sea. And Israel, this nation, marches across dry land out of Egypt. And then as Egypt follows the chariots and the horses and the armies, they follow after them, and the waters go back to the way they were, and they just wipe out all of Pharaoh's army. You can, almost imagine the thrill, right? This massive epic scene of this entire nation finally making it into freedom, and then their enemy, their captors, being wiped out. Over the Christmas break, I decided it was time to show the Lord of the Rings trilogy to my 9-year-old, which time will tell whether that was a good strategy or not. But he seemed to have liked it, but I haven't watched it in a long time. And there was still some of these scenes where, Gandalf shows up, and it's like, yes, like this is it. This is the moment where good wins and evil loses, and we thought it was all lost, and all of a sudden, like, the good team, the good party, God's power, not in Lord of the Rings, but you get it. All of a sudden, like, it's happening. This is the moment we have been waiting for. This is the same thing that happened with Israel leaving slavery and captivity in Egypt. And this is where we jump into the story, Exodus chapter 16, verse 1. It says, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which sounds like an awesome place, which is between Elim and Sinai. And then he says, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt, the writer of Exodus, he gives us an exact date, which I'm grateful for, because it's a fascinating date. It's a fascinating amount of time. What he's saying is that there was an exact amount of time that passed before what I'm about to read happened. And that amount of time is 43 days. 43 days from when they left Egypt All of the plagues, all of the miracles, God's presence, the way that he parted the sea, they walked across dry land, he destroyed Pharaoh's army. 43 days later, this happens. Verse 2, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There, back then, the good old days, we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. 43 days after Israel had been enslaved for 430 years. 43 days after God leaves them out, he hears their cries, he provides a way out, he shows his presence and his power and all these crazy things. 43 days later, they're like, you know what was great? Back when we were enslaved and we had meat to eat. And this is terrible. This reality is not what we want. You have led us into this desert to starve the entire assembly to death. Now, it's interesting to note that they're not actually starving to death. Scholars and historians have talked about this a lot. It was incredibly rare for almost anyone at this point, let alone people that were enslaved, to have meat to eat. This was like a delicacy. So they are remembering the good old days, when they were in slavery, and saying, wasn't it great back then? Don't you wish we could be back then when we could just sit around and eat meat, romanticizing the past like we all do with our own lives? But these guys, they've let us out here to die. 43 days after God miraculously makes a way, leads them into freedom. And granted, they're in the wilderness. It's not the easiest place to be, but 43 days they had already forgotten and already started resenting what they currently had, refusing to understand and acknowledge what God was doing, and looking back at what was and romanticizing the past, wishing that they were there. Instead of being amazed by God's deliverance, they were grumbling because they wanted what things used to be. In the midst of change, Israel was longing for the good old days. When things get rough and disorienting, the predictability of the past starts looking pretty good for all of us. It shows up in a lot of areas in our lives. Many people don't change because they prefer the comfort of their current situation, even if they don't actually like their current situation. John Maxwell said this, a leadership author, speaker. He said, people are more comfortable with old problems than they are with new solutions. We are more comfortable. We know how to exist in this broken system. And if we're going to fix a system, it hurts and it's hard, and I've got to learn new ground rules. And I would rather just have the old problems, wasn't it great when we were in slavery? Do you guys remember how great that was? We had meat. I mean, I get we're free now and God's with us. He let us out. Wasn't it great back then? We all do this. We hold on to the familiar. We do this because our basic instinct and desire is to try and keep control, but that's an illusion also, the amount of control that we actually have. And before we get judgy about Israel, let's remember one of the common phrases that many of us have heard and maybe even used. This phrase, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. You know what? I'd rather just deal with the problems I'm familiar with, the struggles I'm familiar with, the addiction, the habits, the broken relationships, the broken marriage, the strained finances, rather than try something new and I don't know how that's going to go. Let's just do this. Let's just keep on this path. The Israelites essentially say, we might have died in slavery in Egypt, but at least I would have had some sense of control in that process, which is a twisted perspective. I'd rather be enslaved and die there with the ability to control my food than to live in freedom and have to rely on God and others. Egypt was familiar, it was predictable, and it was comfortable, even if it wasn't what they actually wanted. And I feel like so many of us, we choose the same thing. And my fear, my concern for myself and for all of us is that we will say, man, I just wish that things were like they used to be. And there was good. I'm not trying to take away, I'm not trying to say there wasn't any good. I'm not trying to say that 2020 wasn't brutal and we didn't have to deal with things and aren't still having to deal with things, and none of us want to or should have to. But I don't want us to get lost in romanticizing the past and longing for the past. the wilderness, the new place that Israel found themselves was unfamiliar, unpredictable, and uncomfortable. But that has the possibility that God is leading them to something better than they could ever imagine. The wilderness requires us to let go of the devil that we know in order to trust in God as our provider and experience a new and fulfilled life. And so I want us to take a look at what we knew as normal, how much of it was healthy at a level that we would actually be proud of, how much of it was good, how much of it is something that we would actually be like, you know what? I really was crushing it. And I don't mean that sarcastically. Usually when I say crushing it, I don't actually mean crushing it. But you know what? My relationships were the best that they've ever been. You know what? My financial plan was cruising along. You know what? My emotional health, my relationship with God was better than it ever was. And 2020 took that from me. Now, for some of us in some of those categories, I will say that maybe that could be true for some of us. And some things that happened, like I said, over the last 12 months are brutal, and it's not your fault that those things happen. But for most of us, for many of us, if we are honest in the way that we look back, 2020 revealed the cracks and the issues that we were ignoring in a lot of areas of our lives. 2020 highlighted the strained relationships when all of a sudden we had to be home with our family. Can you imagine? 24 hours a day? That's not what I signed up for. I have to be with these people all the time. When we struggled in these different areas, 2020 revealed cracks and gaps that we were ignoring before that. Some we may have had no idea even existed. And while we long for normalcy, it's important that we don't rush back to Egypt, ignoring the captivity of the old way. We serve the same God that led Israel out of captivity and into the promised land, but they had to go through the wilderness first. And so what if what we thought was normal, what if what we're longing for really was a version of captivity? And what if this year, what if our future, what if God really has this beautiful promised land for us? And right now we are finding ourselves in the wilderness, maybe just 43 days after God has led us out. And we're saying, man, wasn't it good back then? We have no idea what's ahead of us. We have no idea the beauty of what's to come. And the crazy thing in Israel's story, we don't have time to look at it all because they kept making the same mistakes over and over again. Not like us. We learn our lessons the first time, right, you guys? This generation, Moses' generation, was not allowed to experience the promised land, not because they were so sinful, not because they were so terrible, but because they continued to grumble and long for the past. They were never allowed to experience the goodness of the promised land. And that same thing could happen for us. We could find ourselves so bitter and frustrated and focused on the past that we miss the beauty of what God is bringing in. What if in our grumbling we miss out on the transformation that God has for us? There's something that Israel, like I said, they continue to struggle with, and God spoke directly about it. Isaiah 43 is a beautiful passage. God is speaking through the prophet to Israel. In Isaiah 43, verse 16, he says, the prophet says this is what the Lord says. The Lord, he who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters, talking about that moment when Israel leaves through the Red Sea. It says, he who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters, he drew out the chariots and the horses, the army and reinforcements together, and they lay there never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. This is the God we're talking about, and this is what he says. Forget the former things. Don't dwell on the past. The God of all of these miracles and power and the signs and all the chaos and everything that had happened before, the God that led them through all of that. He says, forget the former things. Don't dwell on the past. Do you see? I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? It says, I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. Do you not see it? Do you not perceive it? This word perceive has this idea of, are you able to see it in the midst of everything else that's going on? God is speaking to them and he's reminding them about all he's done in the past, and he invites them to forget it. and to look at the new thing that he is doing in the wilderness. The streams that are coming up out of the middle of nowhere in a place that seems impossible and painful and difficult and hard and uncomfortable and all these things. Somehow there's this bubbling up of newness, of life, of goodness that God is doing. And we have the invitation to find that in our own lives. God is always inviting us to see the new, to become something new, to change, to experience change. It's not because God doesn't love us unless we change. It's that because of God's love, we are able to change. We are able to be transformed. Because of the power of his love for us, we get to be vulnerable and say, you know what? I'm going to own this mistake. I don't have to pretend. I'm going to own this habit. I'm going to own this struggle. I'm going to own this strained relationship. I'm going to own these flaws because God loves me anyways. And because of that love, I can step into being transformed, although it is almost never comfortable. So, we would love for things to go back to normal. Maybe even some of you would love to go bowling again, to eat wings, to sing karaoke, share a mic with about 100 other people. We would love for some of these normal things. There's so much about the current reality that is frustrating and challenging and exhausting. Some of us may even want to just call, like if we just had to come up with like a really difficult type of, an adjective to describe this difficult place, maybe we could just call it like a wilderness type of thing. Like we feel a little bit lost. We are not quite self-sufficient. We have to rely on other people a bit more than we wanted to. We're not sure how long we'll be here. We're not sure what everything looks like. But God is inviting us to forget the past, to move towards new opportunities and life in front of us. And the question is, do we see it? Do we perceive it? And maybe the question is, do you want it? Is it something that you want to accept, to embrace, to take hold of? If we're open to it, we can be changed and transformed in ways that allow us to experience greater faith, healthier relationships, a deeper sense of identity, strength in our finances, clarity in our purpose. It is not some easy, quick 3 steps to figuring it all out. I'm not trying to sell anything like that. But that is the invitation that we have to forget the former things and to perceive the new that God is inviting us into. But to stop longing for Egypt and to trust that God is making a way in the wilderness, to be open-handed with the past, to release our sense of control. I'm not sure how many times over the last, 3 days, 4 days, however long it's been now, I'm not sure how many times I've said Happy New Year. It's been a lot. But I do know that not one single person has said, you know what, I want the old year back. I do know that nobody is struggling with that transition from writing 2020 to 2021. Like everybody's like, yeah, I've got this one down pat. We are ready for this new year, for this new, there's just sense of like opportunity and possibility. And if a new year is a good thing, then maybe a new normal can be a good thing too. It doesn't mean that we have to love all of the pain and the tension that we currently live in, but it does mean that we have the opportunity to see that God is doing something new. And if we can perceive it, then we can find life and wholeness in a way that we never have before. We're going to be talking about this over the next few weeks. Faith, relationships, finances, rest, and how we handle our time. But we have to be willing to let go of some of the things from the past and be willing to say, I'm not fully in control, and I acknowledge that, and be willing to live in a little bit of an uncomfortable place so that we can learn and grow into the new, transformed people that God is inviting us to become. And so practically speaking, I want everybody to have a practical step, whether you guys are watching online, here in person. This is something I've been thinking about, and I want to invite you guys to join me in this. I would love for this week for us to make a list of some of the things that we miss the most. Now, if it's bowling, don't tell me. But some of the things that you miss the most from the before. Like, if you will, the sense of, do you guys remember in Egypt when we had potted meat? The sense of, man, do you remember when we used to just be able to go meet up, when we would just bump into people out and about, whatever it might be, to make a list of some of those things that we miss the most, acknowledge and grieve some of the things that we have lost. Maybe they're gone for a season. Maybe some of these things need to be gone for a long time. But to acknowledge these things, because if we do not grieve what we have lost, we will not be able to move forward. And as silly as some of those items might be, grieving what you lost will help you avoid longing for the past. We can miss it. We can grieve it, but we've got to be able to move forward. And if we don't acknowledge what some of these things are, some of them may be serious, heavy, important. Some of them may be light, silly, small. But this is the journey to moving into the promised land. This is the journey to moving through the wilderness, is to letting go of the former ways and seeing the new that God is doing. Let's bow our heads and pray together.